This is the TV Live podcast with Rob Francis.
Today I want to tell the story of how Westward Television quietly, and almost painfully, became Television Southwest, and why for me it still stands as one of the most emotionally complicated handovers in the history of ITV. Westward has always fascinated me, partly because it was so deeply rooted in place, and partly because it was a company that never quite seemed able to decide whether it was a community broadcaster or a small corporate empire in waiting, and that tension runs through its entire life like a fault line. Westward was created by Peter Cadbury, a man who had already been part of the ITV world through his time on the board of Tyne Tees Television, and who clearly believed that the southwest of England deserved its own confident and distinct voice on television, rather than being treated as a distant outpost of somebody else's region. I've always liked the slightly odd, slightly romantic detail that Cadbury named the company after the golf course at Westward Ho in North Devon, which he happened to play on regularly, because it says something quietly revealing about how personal this project was to him, and also how informal and human the early ITV system could still be in the early 1960s, when big regional licenses were still being shaped by individuals, rather than corporate strategies. There is also a rather cruel irony sitting right at the heart of that name, because the town of Westward Ho turned out to be one of the hardest places in the entire region to receive Westward's signal at all, at least until the construction of the Hunshaw cross-transmitter in 1968, finally fixing what must have been an embarrassing technical blind spot for a station literally named after the place. From the start, Westward's region was surrounded by sea on three sides, and the station leaned heavily into that identity, both visually and editorially, with maritime stories, coastal communities, fishing, tourism and local industry forming a large part of its everyday output, and even its company logo reflecting that sense of history and exploration through a silver model of the Golden Hind sitting proudly at the heart of the operation. What I personally find charming about early Westward is how unapologetically local it was, even by ITV standards, because it never really tried to look like London television, and it never pretended that Plymouth and Truro were interchangeable with Birmingham and Manchester, which in today's hyper-centralised media world feels quietly radical rather than quaint. Behind the scenes, though, the company was already far more complicated than its friendly regional image suggested. In January 1969, plans were drawn up for a merger between Westward and the Keith Prowse Company, largely because Cadbury was chairman of both organisations, and by the 17th of that month, the deal had already been completed, pulling Westward into a much broader commercial web through Keith Prowse, and later through EMI, which brought Keith Prowse Music Publishing from Westward later that same year. This is the point in the story where, to me, Westward quietly changes character, because what had begun as a regional broadcasting project starts to behave much more like a holding company. And that almost always brings different priorities into the room, especially when shareholders, tax arrangements and corporate reputation start to matter just as much as local programming. The boardroom atmosphere became increasingly poisonous, and by January 1970, Cadbury had managed the extraordinary feat of being sacked and then rehired within days as chairman, after he publicly attacked the levy on advertising revenue imposed by the Independent Broadcasting Authority, while also withholding a corporation tax payment to the Inland Revenue in protest over exactly the same dispute. I'm going to be honest here, because the story deserves honesty rather than polite neutrality, and say that I have always found Cadbury's behaviour at this stage deeply damaging to the station he had created, because regardless of how strongly he felt about regulation and taxation, Westward existed only by the grace of a publicly awarded licence, and openly antagonising both the regulator and the tax authorities was never going to be a strategy that protected the long-term security of a small regional broadcaster. By July 1980, Cadbury was finally removed from the board, and for the next 6 months he attempted to regain control of the company, which only added to the impression of instability at exactly the moment when ITV companies were supposed to be demonstrating maturity, reliability and good governance ahead of the next franchise round. On screen, however, Westward still looked healthy and ambitious. The station began broadcasting in colour in 1971, initially from the Red Roof transmitter, and then a few months later through both the Stockland Hill transmitter and the Carradon Hill transmitter. And to mark the transition, the famous ident was reshot in colour, which may sound like a small technical footnote now, but at the time it was an enormous statement of modernity for a rural and geographically stretched region that had often been last in line for broadcast upgrades. This is one of the things that makes the collapse of Westward's franchise feel so uncomfortable in hindsight, because outwardly it still behaved like a confident and established ITV company, even while its internal reputation was slowly being eroded. The moment of public reckoning came on the 28th of December 1980, and it could not have been more brutally timed. While the ITV network was showing Drake's Venture, a 2-hour drama produced by Westward to mark the 400th anniversary of the circumnavigation of the globe by Sir Francis Drake, starring John Fore, the programme was interrupted during a commercial break by ITN, which announced that ATV was to undergo major changes, and that both Southern Television and Westward had failed to secure renewal of their licences. Instead, the South West franchise would be awarded to a new company, Television South West. I've always felt that this was one of the cruelest possible ways to deliver such news, because Westward was effectively celebrating British exploration and its own production ambition at the very moment its future was being taken away. And there is something deeply symbolic about a drama built around global travel being used as the backdrop for a regional broadcaster losing its place on the map. From a regulatory point of view, the decision made sense, because the IBA had grown increasingly concerned about corporate stability and governance, but emotionally and culturally, it landed like a public humiliation. What happened next was surprisingly swift. Westward's management chose to sell almost immediately, and in early 1981 the entire company, including staff, buildings and programme library, was brought by Television South West for £2.38 million. For most viewers, very little changed at first, because the new owners continued to use the Westward name and symbol on screen throughout 1981, and only on the 31st of December did the station finally rebrand fully as TSW. This transitional year is something I find oddly touching, because it allowed Westward to fade rather than collapse, and it gave audiences time to adjust to the idea that their familiar regional identity was being gently replaced, rather than abruptly erased. A special programme, 20 Years of Westward, was broadcast on the 21st of December 1981, presented by Roger Shaw, and recorded in front of a studio audience, with the theme taken from Westward Ho by Hastings Mann. Now, the guest list alone tells you how seriously the station took its own legacy, with Angela Rippon, Kenneth MacLeod and Sheila Kennedy in the studio, and filmed contributions from Alan Freeman, Jan Leeming and David Vine, all woven together with clips from across Westward's output. The programme ended with a message from Peter Cadbury himself, wishing the new company well.
I wish the successive companies who run Westward all the luck in the world.
I find that moment strangely moving, because it is one of the few times in ITV history when a founder publicly acknowledges that the institution he created has moved beyond him, even though so much of its downfall had been shaped by his own conduct. Unlike some other companies that lost their licenses in the same round, Westward, now effectively run by its successor, chose to hand over quietly at midnight on the 31st of December 1981, continuing seamlessly as Television South West. When I look back at how Westward became Television South West, I don't see a simple story of failure, and I certainly don't see a weak broadcaster being replaced by a better one, because Westward's programmes, people and regional commitment were never really the problem. What I see instead is a cautionary tale about how fragile trust is between broadcasters and regulators, and how quickly a company can lose credibility when its leadership appears to treat public regulation as an inconvenience, rather than as the foundation that allows commercial television to exist at all. Westward mattered to the South West because it made the region visible to itself, And that achievement didn't vanish when the logo changed to TSW, because the studios, the staff, and the local knowledge all carried on working the next day under a different name. Yet something intangible did disappear, and that was the slightly eccentric, personality-driven spirit that had shaped the company in its earliest years, for better and for worse. In the end, the transformation of Westward into Television Southwest feels less like a dramatic takeover and more like a quiet correction by the system. A reminder that in British broadcasting, creativity and community can thrive only when the structures that protect them are treated with respect, even by the people bold enough to build a station in the first place.
This has been the TV Live podcast with Rob Francis, a Red Telephone Box production.